Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Sunday session where I'm going to explore with you a little bit about what it means to find God. Now, in movies and those sorts of things, often people in prison are said to find God, and the expression is used as a bit of an eye roll. Well, they found God. They're wanting to get out of prison, or they want to show that everyone they've turned over and now they're good, or something like that. And so it's often sort of disparaged, this idea of finding God. And maybe you've got a friend who found God at some point and you don't really know what to make of it. Well, this morning I want to explore a little bit of what it might mean to find God and how it happens. And that happens differently for different people, really. Now, a Bible verse that sort of pushes in this direction and shows that the words are okay to say come from Jeremiah 29, chapter 13. There are other passages in the Bible like this. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart, says the Lord, as recorded through the prophet Jeremiah in the Old Testament of the Bible. So here's the idea of someone finding God in the Bible's own language. So how can it happen? Well, there isn't one way that it happens. There isn't one mode only. But in fact, there are many stories and many sort of accounts of how people found God or how God found them. And the Bible uses both ways of looking at it, none without the other in many ways, that God does seek people and that people seek God. That's something that is consistent throughout the Bible. So if someone says they're seeking God or they've found God, that's appropriate language to use. Now, how can that happen? Well, I want to use 3 Bible examples of how it did happen to talk about how it can happen today. And it does happen today in these ways. The first way I want to talk about of how people find God is totally out of the blue. And I want to use the Apostle Paul as an example of this because he actually hated the church. He was persecuting followers of Jesus. And he was on the road to a city called Damascus. This is in the New Testament times. There to persecute more Christians and throw them into prison, where suddenly, out of the blue, there's a blinding light from heaven and Jesus speaks to him. And he said, why are you persecuting me? And obviously he has no real good reply. And it begins the absolute turning point in his life where he has this sudden, miraculous, out of the blue encounter with Jesus, and it changes everything. And in fact, he tells his story twice more in the book of Acts in the New Testament. Very, very important in the life and the story of the kind of mission of the Apostle Paul. So one way that people find God is this out of the blue experience where they were going one way and no intention of changing course or discovering something fresh, but boom, all of a sudden God does this. Now, this can happen in a dream or a vision, and I know a number of people who've been given those sorts of things, and they have absolutely pivoted at that moment and understood that God is speaking to me, and I've found God in doing that. So one way is really out of the blue, and it kind of surprises people that suddenly they find God. Another way is a kind of in the family way, and that is we kind of grow into this faith. And Timothy in the New Testament is an example of this. His grandmother and his mum were committed followers of God and Christ. And Timothy grew up in a home where this was sort of central. And at least from his grandma and mum's point of view, don't hear about dad. Maybe dad wasn't interested. We don't know. But the bottom line is that he grew into faith because he saw it, lived in these people in his life that he loved. And he kind of caught the faith. Now, I'm going to explain soon that there has to be a moment of personal decision. We just don't inherit the faith of our family, but we can be in a situation where we're surrounded by it and we embrace it. And so a second way of finding God is that it's in the family and it kind of is natural to you and you grow into faith. The third way I want to talk about is little by little. And I want to use Lydia in the Bible. She was a businesswoman, an outstanding person in the New Testament. And she was described as kind of a God-fearing person. She didn't come from a background, as far as we know, that had any religious orientation, particularly concerning the Jewish faith or the Christian faith. So she didn't have that to grow up into. There was no kind of out of the blue moment where suddenly she heard a voice from heaven. She actually heard someone preaching the story of Jesus, and she was already a God-fearer. And what that means is that she already had this respect for God in her life. She already revered God and understood that there was a being above her and all things, and that she wanted to worship and know this God. And so hearing the good news about Jesus became a moment for her where she embraced this person, Jesus, and found God in a way that she'd never found him before. This was the moment of her conversion, which is often the way we describe it based on the things that the New Testament talks about. So there are three ways that people can find God, and they're pretty important. Here they are listed out here. That for some people it's out of the blue, for some people it's in the family and they kind of grow into it a bit, for other people it's little by little, or it could be a combination of these. For example, you might be sort of taking a tentative little number of steps towards Jesus little by little. You're growing in your interest in faith, perhaps the Christian faith particularly, and then out of the blue something will happen and boom, you'll come through and you'll find God. If you seek him, the Bible says, with all your heart. Some people grow up in a family that's oriented towards faith, and they walk away, or they don't get it and don't want it, and they go on a journey in life, and then perhaps little by little or out of the blue something happens, and suddenly they find God that people in their family knew but they never did. And that can be sort of how it happens. So there's no one way of doing this. It could be a combination of a bunch of these, where people, by whatever means and circumstances, end up finding God. So that's how it can happen. All of a sudden, out of the blue, those sorts of things. But what I want to talk about now is, what does it mean to find God? For a lot of people, God is on the margins of their life, or they don't believe in God at all. So that's the case for many, many people. And if they do have some inkling about God, they might be in a crisis of some situation and pray, look, God, if you're there, would you please help me? And if you do, I'll do this or that. So they make kind of a deal. And they reach out for God who's on the margins, or they don't even believe yet, but they say, well, if you are, come now and help me. And that's how they reach out for God, or that's what they think that it means to know God, that he's there for us in emergency situations or whatever. But when people find God, everything changes when they really find God. Now, God can answer those prayers, by the way, and people can still reject God and say, well, thanks, see you later. That happens. But the bottom line is that that's not really finding God, that's using God, and that's a different thing. But anyway, you can have that situation where God is just someone you bring in when you need him, or in the situation of someone who really finds God, God becomes the center of all. And this is the story of the people I've described from Bible times, and it's true of people today, that God becomes the center of everything. That, as the Apostle Paul went on to say, in him we live and we move and we have our being. That wasn't a quote from a Christian poet, by the way. It was just a poet from the Greek world who understood something really important, that in God we live and we move and we have our being. So everything that we have, we owe to God. And a Christian understands that he is the source and the center. So that's what it means to find God, but it also changes the way that we look at the world and the way that we perceive things. Because when someone finds God and God comes to the center, that reality begins to work out in the way that we relate to other people. Not perfectly, but as we grow and mature in our faith, we get better at being healthy and holy in the way that we relate to people, but also how we perceive the future and the life that we're living and the future that we're hoping for. And again, Christian people who found God understand that this life is very short. It's transitory. The Bible itself calls the life of a human being like a breath, and it's over. The grass, it rises up and the sun burns it, withers, and it's gone. This life passes really quickly, and someone who's found God realizes that we have touched eternity and that our hope now in God endures beyond this life and into the life to come, where we have a life of absolute completeness in this God that we found. And so that's what changes everything. We don't just say, okay, I've found God now so I can access him more easily when I need him. He comes into the center, and then he begins to sort of change our whole perspective about all sorts of things. And someone who's truly found God might still wrestle with what life brings, and we might have the shadows of our doubts and all sorts of things like that. It doesn't mean that it's easy or necessarily always straightforward and clear, but there is a purpose and a process of our journey of faith where we keep on keeping on, even with our doubts and our questions. So finding God is to have him at center, and from that center to understand all things and to see everything from that perspective. That's what it really means to find God. Now, this might happen quickly for some of us. It might happen after a long time, might never happen for some people. But I love what the Apostle Paul, who was one of the out of the blue people, he said to a leader that he was talking to one day, who said, "Do you think, Paul, that you can really quickly convert me so that I can come follow Jesus too?" And Paul replies, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you but all those listening to me may become what I am." And that is someone who has found God, someone who has God at center and whose whole life is lived with a perspective, God's perspective, about how things are and how things will be. So that's what it means to find God. And my prayer is that those who are watching or listening to this, short time or long, may become not what I am, not in terms of my personality or any of those crazy things, but become what I am in terms of someone whose life is centered on God and whose whole perspective is lived from that centering experience. So God bless you, hey, whether you are someone who's grown up in the faith, whether you're someone who little by little is maybe increasing in your interest in spiritual things, or you might be someone who just out of the blue, boom, I didn't care about God. I remember a neighbor of mine who became a follower of Jesus, going back a few years now, said, I don't know why I'm having this conversation with you, because 1 week ago I would never have talked about God. It just wasn't something that was in my world. Then all of a sudden things changed. These are the stories of people that I know over many years who found God. And my prayer and hope is that you find him too, hey? God bless you.